We're dealing with the Renaissance as we begin today's series of lectures in Western civilization. We will go through the Renaissance up to the modern era of current history. So we're going to cover things in some broad brush strokes, similar to the way we did last quarter. We're going to deal with issues thematically. So one of the things we're going to look at as we look at the Renaissance today, we're going to look at some of the historical underpinnings, the events that shaped what happened during the Renaissance, and then we're going to look at some issues within the Renaissance era as it particularly relates to how it affects contemporary Western civilization. What happened then that affects the way we think now? So we're going to look at a variety of things there with the Renaissance. Literally, it means rebirth. So the Renaissance I've termed as the transition between the medieval and the modern worlds. Medieval world being the world dominated by the Catholic Church from about 600 or so AD until approximately 1500 or so AD. The Renaissance is a period stretching in the late 1300s through the early 1600s that began to transition out of a medieval mindset on how the world worked and began to see the world from a bigger perspective, a larger perspective. We see that in a variety of ways. We'll show some of those. But here's the history, the historical framework. The first Renaissance painter was Giotto, 1267 to 1337. And by the way, as I've done before, I'll let you know what you need to know for the test purposes. He's the first Italian Renaissance artist. That means he added depth to painting. Up until then, and I don't know if you'll remember the mosaic that I showed you last quarter in looking at art in the Middle Ages, but art in the Renaissance was different. It was distinct. It added something. Well, one of the things that it added was depth. And you can see that with the perspective there in Giotto's Lamentation. How it's not 3D, but it appears as if they're adding layers behind the picture, or throughout the picture. What's fascinating there is Giotto was one of the first ones to ever do that, first one in the Renaissance period to do that, and then they got picked up on by other artists, and we'll look at several of those in a few moments. More historical issues. You had the Babylonian captivity of the popes. This is a fascinating piece of Christian history related to the Catholic Church Christian history. The popes moved from Rome, Italy, to Avignon, France. A French pope was elected. You know how popes are elected, right? There's a college of cardinals. They act as essentially what would be like a board of governors, say at a school institution. And that board of governors functions as the body that determines who would be made president or who would be made chancellor at an institution. Yes, sir.
Similar to how Julius Caesar was.
Yeah, similar because you have the same thing. The Catholic Church modeled itself structurally, governmentally after the Roman Empire.
Okay.
So like Caesar was elected to be a general, or one of the what's the term? One of the executives. It's not the term though. I can't remember. It's awful that I can't remember that. It's not my notes.
Emperors?
He wasn't an emperor. He was a dictator to begin with, but he was essentially a general that became a dictator, the first dictator in the Roman era. But under the Roman Republic, it wasn't technically an emperor. Yes, he was elected by the Senate.
Right.
So he was in the Senate. He was elected out of the Senate to serve in his particular role. Very similar to the way popes are elected today. A pope who is elected by the College of Cardinals comes from the College of Cardinals. And so I guess the most recent one was, about 2 or 3 years ago? They meet in a room, close the door, lock the door, and then when a different colored smoke comes out from the chimney, they have come to agreement on who their pope is. Well, in this particular case, the College of Cardinals elected a French pope rather than an Italian pope. And the French pope decided, rather than live at Rome, which they had done for 800 years at that point. He moved the capital of the church, or the seat of the church, to Avignon, France. He liked France better. France is prettier. So he moved the seat of Rome, the seat of the church, to Avignon, France. The problem with that was the Italian church didn't like it, and the Italian cardinals didn't like it. So do you know what they did in response?
Probably excommunicated him or
They elected an Italian pope. And so you had an Italian pope presiding in Rome and a French pope presiding in Avignon, France. Do you know what they proceeded to do after that? I don't remember which one started it, but one of them excommunicated the other one. And then the other one excommunicated the other one.
So they both had.
Yes. And so it's called the Babylonian captivity of the Roman Catholic Church, because it is not a pretty part of Roman church history. Now you say excommunication, big deal. I mean, excommunication in the Baptist church is saying you're no longer welcome to fellowship with us. Okay, that happens rarely, but it does happen. You know, it's happened at our church where we've looked at someone and say you're no longer welcome on our church campus. And there are a variety of reasons why that happens. We don't do that because you look at us weird. You know, we've done that. And in one case that I know of, we had someone who was continuously and intentionally disruptive, and wouldn't change his mind. And I'm not talking about standing up in a service when you're not supposed to stand up. I'm talking about, you know, complete, blatant, open disrespect to pastors and to church staff and deacons. I mean, it got bad, and we just asked him for a time period that you're no longer welcome to be here. If this is the way you're going to be, well, I mean, big deal. That doesn't have any. I mean, it's a big deal, but it's not a big deal. In the Catholic Church, if you were excommunicated, salvation in Catholic theology means that you're a part and underneath the church. Salvation only comes through the church in Catholic doctrine, which means if you're out from under the church, according to Catholics, you're not a part of Christ. If you're not a part of Christ, you're not a part of the church, you're not saved. You're not forgiven. All right? Which is why it was such a big deal, and we'll look at this next week when we explore the Reformation era, when the Roman Catholic Pope excommunicated Martin Luther and essentially started the Protestant Reformation, at least effectively started it. Luther started it before then, but effectively made the division between Luther and Lutheranism, which would become Protestantism, and Catholicism. That was a big deal because the Pope was doing the greatest thing he could do to diminish Luther's theology. He was excommunicating him, saying, you're not part of the church, you're not a part of Christ, you're not a part of salvation. Of course, Luther understood differently. It's not what the Bible teaches. But within Catholic doctrine, think about this. The two elected leaders of the Catholic Church had been excommunicated by one another. So the vicar of Christ, the representative of Christ based on Catholic theology, Catholic doctrine, to the entire church body, the universal church body, one of them was not saved, one of them was saved, depending on which side you were on. You following me? I mean, this is a major black mark on Catholic church doctrine, and a problem in its own day. This lasted for about 70 years. It was a mess, is what it was. And events like this were part of the events that led into Luther's desire to see a reform in the church, which would become the Protestant Reformation. It was in response to Pope Boniface VIII and his Unum Sanctum, which is his bull stated this: the unity of the church, the necessity of belonging to the church for salvation, the Pope as the supreme authority of the church, and submission to him as a requirement for salvation. And so the excommunications happened as a result of that particular statement back and forth. This eventually led to the Western Schism of 1378 and 1417, where reforms by Urban VI created controversies and excommunications back and forth between Avignon and Rome. What I just mentioned. It was a mess, is what it was. More history in the period of the Renaissance. The 100 Years' War, 1337 to 1453, was between England and France. That's the war in which Joan of Arc died, 1431. The French ultimately drove the English out of France, and that was where the English tried to take over France. So they crossed the Channel. So they've been fighting for years, the French and the English. The Black Death of 1347, a bubonic plague, is what that was. And then 1384 and 1415 were the martyrdoms of John Wycliffe and Jan Hus, and they were precursors to the Protestant Reformation. Wycliffe, of course, what's he famous for?
Languages.
Yeah, he translated the Bible into the language of the common man.
Right.
And the Catholic Church did not approve of that because the Scripture, according to Catholic doctrine, needs to come in their language. Latin. Good. And Huss was killed for similar reasons, or martyred for similar reasons of disagreeing with the doctrine of the Catholic Church. So they were precursors to the Reformation.
What year was Jan?
1415.
Are the lecture notes available online?
Not currently, but I'm gonna post them. I just didn't get to that this week. Believe it or not, I do other things over break. No, seriously, I'll get them posted. I'm going to try to get them all posted for every week that we're going, so you can have them prepared when you come in if you use a computer. More in the historical framework, you have the life of Lorenzo de' Medici, 1449 and 1492. He's the elder of the Medici family who ruled in Florence, Italy, which is the birthplace of the Renaissance. He's important because he's essentially a kingmaker, and it's Medici. He has had influence in Florence. One of the reasons the Renaissance could actually happen was because economics had changed during this particular era. You had the rise of merchants. In fact, if you read anything from Shakespeare, any of his tragedies or any of his comedies, he talks about merchants. He talks the Merchant of Venice is one of them, right? And then there are other merchants that play roles in different of his plays. And of course, he's writing in the next 100 years or so. But he's writing about, in some cases, about this particular era. Well, this era created a new sense of wealth, particularly in Florence. I mean, for example, the Renaissance, we know it today based on its artwork. Michelangelo, Leonardo, Raphael, not the Ninja Turtles. Not the Ninja Turtles, the artists.
Splinter wasn't a big old artist?
The original artists, no play. He was not. But we know it for their art. Well, why could we talk about art in the Renaissance period but for wealthy people who could employ men to just paint? I mean, Leonardo, Michelangelo, Raphael, and these others, Giotto had to earn a living somehow. How did they earn a living? They earned a living by painting. People bought their artwork. People hired them to do all kinds of different artwork that they would then hang in their houses. But wealth had to be accumulated for that to happen. So, de' Medici was a wealthy citizen of Florence, Italy, and he has influence. We'll talk about him a little bit more in a moment, because he has a relative who had a very interesting future. In 1453, you had the fall of the Constantinople to the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire are who? Turks, who are who?
The Muslims.
Muslims, that's right. The Muslims finally attained their goal that they had been attempting since 750 AD, which was to overtake Constantinople and overtake the Roman Empire. And they attacked the Byzantine Empire at that point, but they attacked the empire for years and years and years and years, and finally in 1453 they overran Constantinople. That's why when I showed you the Hagia Sophia, it has the spires that were added, and it's become it's a museum now, but it was, as a church, was turned into a mosque because the Ottoman Turks overran Constantinople in 1453, thus ending what began as the Roman Empire nearly 2,000 years previous. Gutenberg printed his Bible at Mainz. in 1454, printing press. Fascinating, the first book printed was not anything other than a Bible, right? More historical framework, and we'll get into some other details. You had Columbus sailing for the first time to the Americas in 1492. England's War of the Roses, which practically ended with Henry VII establishing the Tudor dynasty. That was 1455 to 1485. Pope Alexander VI. Let's see. He's known as a Borgia Pope, 1492 to 1503. He's known for his intense debauchery and corruption. Let me look at something. Yeah. If I'm not mistaken, Pope Alexander was a Medici before he was renamed Pope Alexander. He's a nephew of Lorenzo de' Medici, and he was kind of swiped into the role of being the Pope because of his uncle's influence in Florence, Italy. Shows you the influence he had. But Pope Alexander was elected Pope from the College of Cardinals with known mistresses and known illegitimate children.
Oh, gotta love the Catholic Church.
Yeah. Well, and you notice the time frame, 1492 to 1503. This is a precursor to the Reformation. I mean, Luther nailed his 95 Theses to the door of the Wittenberg Church in what year? I'm going to tell you later, but 15 what?
13.
Close.
1513.
1517.
17.
October 31st, 1517. And so the period of this debauchery among the popery, in the papacy would be the correct way to say that, was a precursor and was a reason for Luther and many others looking at the Catholic Church and laughing at it and saying it needed to be reformed, it needed to be changed, there needed to be a change in leadership, change in direction. Because, I mean, and when I say known, when he was elected Pope, the cardinals knew that he had mistresses, knew that he had illegitimate children, and they came and went as they pleased as he was Pope. Showtime did a series called The Borgias. You might remember that? Not that you watched it, but I'm not saying you did, but I mean, I have Dish TV, and so they do commercials for all kind of shows on Showtime and HBO. Mm-hmm. That's talking about this era of the papacy. If Showtime can do a series on the papacy, you know it's not good. And what's probably fascinating, and I've not seen the show and don't plan on it, they probably didn't have to make too much of. That's what's sad. I mean, this is known. This gentleman, Pope Alexander VI, is one of the vicars of Christ in Roman Catholic tradition and theology. He represented, according to them, according to their doctrine, represented them to the world. And he was known for intense wickedness. Yes?
I just found a video, it's probably been out, but Tares versus the Wheat, talk about the papacy, the Catholic Church through the history, how they tried to tank the Bible and the manuscripts and all that.
Yeah, they're not the holders of doctrine that we would hold. Another pope, the pope that followed him, is known as Papa Terrible. Pope Julius II, 1503 to 1513. He's known as the warring pope. Essentially, here's what he did. He raised an army. And he went to a city and took it over. And some of our Southern Baptist leaders are not tremendously popular in contemporary culture. But imagine if Dr. Al Mohler had all the Second Amendment students at Southern Seminary grab their guns and say, let's go set up Louisville as a Christian kingdom. Come help me take over Louisville. Can you imagine the pushback? I mean, I realize we're in a different era, but that's exactly what Pope Julius did. He raised an army and said, I'm Pope, come follow me. and he took over a city. He was also the Pope who hired Michelangelo to paint the Sistine Chapel.
In those days, it was sometimes hard to tell the difference between the Pope and the King. I mean,
There wasn't much
they had
difference.
equal powers.
Yeah, there wasn't much difference. And at this point in Catholic history, popes were viewed as authoritarians. I mean, their whole role was power in their own mind. It wasn't spiritual. It wasn't spiritual. Does anyone know how he paid Michelangelo to paint the Sistine Chapel? What he used to pay for the Sistine Chapel? It's a famous word in church history.
Indulgence.
Indulgence?
Indulgences.
That's how he raised money to pay for the Sistine Chapel. You know what indulgences are, right? It's what Martin Luther said was unbiblical. It's one of the main reasons why he wrote his 95 Theses. Indulgences were people paying Catholic priests for their family to come out of purgatory. When a coin in the coffer rings, a soul from purgatory springs. That was kind of the little catch line, the catchphrase. And so you could, if you had an uncle or aunt and you weren't sure about their soul's condition, Catholic doctrine has purgatory, which is the intermediary place between heaven and hell. I'm not entirely sure if anybody in purgatory ever ends up in hell, but it's not heaven. I'm not sure how that works. But if you paid enough money and prayed enough prayers, or had a Catholic priest pray enough prayers and say enough Hail Marys over your aunt, uncle, mother, father, brother, sister, friend, mistress, whoever it was, if you prayed enough, had someone pray enough over them, they could be pulled out of purgatory and sent to heaven. And it's a money-making tool. And that's how Papa Terrible paid Michelangelo to paint the Sistine Chapel. Michelangelo did not have a choice, by the way. He didn't really want to do the job. It actually permanently disabled him. It took him, I think, 4 years to paint the Sistine Chapel, and because he was laying on his back, and destroyed his neck and his arms, and just crippled him. He didn't want to do it, but of course, what do you think the Pope held over his head? Excommunication. You don't do what I ask you to do, you're not going to heaven. That's the authority of the Pope in the Roman Catholic era.
What was the word they used for the guys that they put into the Crusades? They forgave their iniquities as they went forward to spread Christendom with a sword. I don't know.
I know the word you're talking about, Mike, but I can't remember it. I can't put it off the top of
But
my
not
head.
indulgences, but something like that.
Yeah.
Some blanket deal that you're covered no matter
Blanket
what
forgiveness. Yeah.
you do. Yeah.
How long did you say it took them to do the Sistine Chapel?
I think it was 4 years,
4 years.
if I remember correctly. I could be off on the years by a couple, but it's several years. Another important Renaissance figure is Niccolo Machiavelli. He wrote The Prince, which is a recognition of the evil within human nature. He was a star in Florence, Italy initially. And then he made somebody mad. He made one of the Medicis mad. And so they sent him out of the city, excommunicated him. And he wrote The Prince as kind of a peace offering, trying to get back in the good graces of the Medici family. The Prince is a work. If you deal with anything in political theory or in philosophy, you'll have to read The Prince, because it's a seminal work in political theory and in contemporary political philosophy. Because what he does is he evaluates leaders, political leaders, that he had access to evaluate. So he looked at emperors, and he looked at popes, and he looked at religious leaders, and he looked at generals. He looked at Julius Caesar. He looked at others within the Roman era, and he said, here's how they led, and here's what they did, and here's what you should do. He made comments similar to the effect of you shouldn't want to be loved, you should want to be feared. If you've heard that type of phrase, it found its original thought, at least pinning it down, in Machiavelli's The Prince. Fascinating work. I don't always agree with it, but It's a fascinating introduction into political theory and leadership theory. Anyway, that's Machiavelli. By the way, just as a side note, about 2 years ago, I had a student who came back to me and said, "Man, I'm so glad that you shared that about Machiavelli and the Prince, because it was a question or an answer on Jeopardy." And he knew the answer because he had heard about the Prince in Western Civ class. Not that that really matters. It's not just trivia. It's more than trivia. But sometimes it'll actually come back to assist you. Make sense? All right, let's keep going. Art in the Renaissance movement went from the static medieval art that lacked perspective to some of the most dynamic and humanistic art the world has ever seen. For example, this is Florentine art. It's one of the primary locations for the advancement of the Renaissance movement. Who is that in the center?
Jesus.
Mm-hmm. Not sure he ever presided over a church that looked quite like that in history. But that wasn't the goal of the Renaissance art either, to show things as they could have been. It was to show things in their ideal. In other words, what they would have pictured Jesus as being and doing in all of his in all of their idea of his grand glory.
They put the halos over their head to show like holiness. Right?
Yeah. Halos represent sainthood. You get Raphael. History was their content. The artists of the Renaissance era painted history. So they would have painted things from biblical history, and that's obvious because the Catholic Church dominated the era, and so many of the people who requested art that they would then pay for requested art that was painted about biblical history, because they were Christians or they were connected to the Catholic Church. They also painted about history in terms of philosophy, and that's what this is, the School at Athens. Right here, I don't have anything to point out, but I can do this. Right here are Plato and Socrates. Actually, no, I'm telling you wrong. Plato's here. He's the old guy. Aristotle's here because it's the School at Athens.
Where did those guys get their grocery money?
What do you mean, the painters?
Those guys right there, the main.
Plato and Aristotle. They had a school.
So people were paid.
People paid them to send,
Okay.
just like you pay Dr. Horton to be your president.
Okay.
Not technically, you pay about half. The Baptist State Convention of North Carolina pays the rest. That's why your education is so cheap. Half the budget of Fruitland is made up for by North Carolina Baptist. That's why, if you're blessed by what you get here, the education you get here, you should be a part of Southern Baptist life, North Carolina Baptist life. You should support the school. You should support North Carolina Baptist. Why? Paid for half your education.
Right.
How many of you would like a double tuition tomorrow? Then you can fuss and complain about North Carolina Baptist all you want. But you want to double your tuition. But if that's a good point. And I don't mean to preach a little bit, but some guys walk out of here with an axe to grind, and they run away from Southern Baptist life, and run away from North Carolina Baptist, and they don't like the bureaucracy, and they don't like this, and they don't like that, they don't like the other. I mean, it's fine for you to do that, but just realize that they paid for half your education. Pretty generous. All right? So you can complain, but you're not going to get an ear from those of us who know where the money comes from. I'm not going to listen to a complainer when they got paid half their education. If you want to offer and say, I want to complain all I want, I'm going to pay twice the amount for my education. More power to you. I'll listen to you all day long because you've actually backed it up with your money. Stop preaching. Where are your eyes drawn in that picture?
It's the ceiling, I guess.
Why?
That hallway really is.
To the arches,
Yeah, the arches draw you to where?
to the center of the picture.
To who?
Plato.
Who's in the center of the picture?
Plato and
Aristotle.
something.
Aristotle.
Or Aristotle.
You notice something else that's fascinating. You see that? You see the shapes. If you take a line and you draw a straight line from here, where does it go?
To the center.
And right here, this line right here,
Mm-hmm.
same place. This line right here. This guy right here, where does he point?
The center.
To the center. This piece of wood right here, where's it point? All that's intentional. Called geometric symmetry. This is an advancement in art in the Renaissance period. They did that in order to draw your attention to the main point of the painting. Yes, sir.
On the very back row, there's a guy pointing that way. Is that like significant?
This guy right here?
Yep.
Okay, draw a line from where he's pointing back this way.
Oh. That wouldn't go right.
Yeah, I know he's pointing away. Yeah, I get that. But if you draw lines from almost everything, not everything's that way. I mean, you got a guy here who's bending over and some different things. But I'm talking about everything about the broad scale of the picture takes you where? To the very center of the picture. Why? Because that's the main point of the picture. The goal of the picture is to get you to look at Aristotle and Plato. It's not that everything else isn't nice to look at, but that's the goal of the picture. Not only geometric symmetry and the advancement there, but you also get the the movement within Renaissance art toward the ideal. In other words, they don't paint people as they are. They paint people as they want them to be. And a good example is the Sistine Chapel. Who's that on the left?
Adam. John. Adam.
Adam. Thank you. Who wouldn't want to look like Adam? I mean, look at those. Look at those arms. I mean, those are huge. Perfect features.
So that is the complete picture of what's hanging in the hall.
That's on the chapel. That's on the ceiling in the Sistine Chapel.
You know, I'm talking about out here in this hall. That's,
Oh, we have that, really?
The bottom parts,
Oh, really?
like the two hands.
Yes, that's the complete picture. That's right. It's God touching Adam. And even look at God. I mean, look at the biceps on God the Father.
I mean, I would.
Those are massive. Well, I mean, yeah.
Probably.
But the point being, when Michelangelo painted this, he wasn't painting this as he thought it would have exactly looked when the event happened. He's picturing the ideal human, and that's what the Renaissance era is all about. It's the ideal. It portrays, think about David, the statue of David, Michelangelo's David. I mean, David's the man in that statue. I mean, he's standing there, he looks like a guy all of us want to be, and none of us are. And that's not who we are. Realism didn't get introduced into art until a few hundred years later. But in the Renaissance period, this is what art is all about: the ideal human portrait or human picture.
Wasn't there a reason that they didn't actually touch?
You know, I don't know. I haven't researched it enough to know that, so I'm not entirely sure.
Almost touching.
And then you get one of my favorites, Leonardo and the ideal human. And we will talk about the ideal human in a minute. It's the Vitruvian Man. You see him touching the box or the rectangle there with his arms and his feet, and you also see him touching the circle there. And we'll talk about what his idea of humanism is in just a moment. But that's Leonardo and ideal human. For geometric symmetry, though, let's look at another painting. The what? The Last Supper. Again, look at the symmetry. Where are your eyes drawn?
Jesus.
That's right. You've got this little outline of the table that draws your attention to the center of the picture that points up. You've got Jesus, and of course the Da Vinci Code made way too much of the particular lines in in this particular painting. I don't know what Leonardo was thinking. I certainly know this is not a historical representation of the Last Supper. If for no other reason that at the Last Supper in Jewish life would not have been at a table where they were sitting. That's why they washed their feet. They would have been lounging. They didn't have tables they sat at. They had tables they laid at. But, you know, we're picking and choosing, I guess. But in other words, his portrait, though, draws your attention to Jesus. The way the room goes backward, the three windows in the back, the larger window being right behind Jesus' head, his arms pointing this way, you know, acting as a triangle that points your attention to Jesus. And that was Leonardo's point. He wanted you to focus on the central figure in the painting, which was, of course, Jesus. Or if you are a fan of Dan Brown, Mary Magdalene. Right?
Right.
No.
No.